On August 27, 1991, a Soviet ministry in Moscow issued a routine directive to regional administrators across all 15 republics. The directive concerned grain distribution for the coming winter. It specified quotas, transport schedules, and storage allocations according to the central plan. 3 republics ignored it completely. 2 others sent responses that amounted to polite refusals. The ministry had no mechanism to enforce compliance. Orders still flowed from Moscow, but somewhere in the previous 18 months, obedience had become optional. This was not a breakdown of communication. The telegrams arrived. The bureaucrats read them. They simply chose not to follow them. And the center, which had commanded the largest land empire on Earth for 7 decades, had no practical way to make them comply without resorting to force. It was no longer willing or able to use. 4 months later, the Soviet Union would cease to exist. 15 independent republics would replace it. The replacement happened so quickly that governments were still using Soviet postage stamps and currency weeks after the Union formally dissolved. Ministries evaporated, a military with over 4 million personnel and thousands of nuclear weapons fragmented along republic lines. Economic ties that had connected Ukraine's factories to Kazakhstan's resources for generations snapped. The state that had defeated Nazi Germany and competed with the United States for global dominance came apart in less time than it takes to plan a wedding. The speed is the mystery. Empires decline over decades. The Soviet Union collapsed in 16 months. To understand how, you need to understand what held it together in the first place. Before 1985, the Soviet Union functioned as a unitary state despite its formal federal structure. 15 republics existed on paper, each with its own government, parliament, and Communist Party branch. In practice, Moscow controlled everything that mattered. The Central Committee of the Communist Party made decisions. Republic leaders implemented them. Dissent was not tolerated. The KGB monitored potential opposition. Economic planning occurred in Moscow. Factories in Uzbekistan, mines in Kazakhstan, and ports in Estonia operated according to directives written by planners who had never visited those places. This system required 2 things to function: material incentives and credible coercion. The Soviet state provided jobs, housing, education, and basic consumer goods. Not abundance, but predictability. In exchange, citizens accepted political restrictions. When incentives failed to secure compliance, coercion filled the gap. Dissidents were arrested, protests were suppressed. Entire populations were relocated when Moscow deemed it necessary. The threat of force hovered in the background of every interaction between the center and the periphery. The system was inefficient, but it was stable. Stability depended on the center maintaining both capacity and will. Capacity meant the economic resources to fund the military and security services, pay pensions, subsidize housing, and keep goods moving between republics. Will meant the readiness to use force when necessary. For decades, Moscow had both. Then, Mikhail Gorbachev became General Secretary in March 1985. Gorbachev inherited an economy in decline. Growth rates had been falling for years. The Soviet Union was spending unsustainable amounts on defense to compete with the United States. Consumer goods remained scarce. Corruption was endemic. Gorbachev believed the system could be reformed without being dismantled. He introduced glasnost, which meant openness, a reduction in censorship, and an increase in public debate. He introduced perestroika, economic restructuring that allowed limited private enterprise and reduced central planning. He allowed contested elections, first within the Communist Party, then for government positions. These reforms were intended to revitalize socialism. They had the opposite effect. Glasnost removed fear. Once people could speak publicly without automatic punishment, they began identifying problems the state had hidden for decades. Environmental disasters, corruption, ethnic tensions, historical crimes like the secret protocols of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which had allowed Stalin to annex the Baltic states in 1940. In the Baltic republics, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, this revelation provided a legal argument for independence. If the annexation had been illegal under international law, then Soviet rule lacked legitimacy from the beginning. Contested elections gave opposition movements institutional platforms. In 1989, Baltic republics elected parliaments dominated by independent supporters. These were not revolutionaries operating underground. They were elected officials using the new rules Gorbachev had created. They began passing laws that contradicted Soviet law. They declared their languages official, their flags and anthems restored. They claimed ownership of resources on their territory. Moscow could have responded with force. Gorbachev refused. He believed reform required allowing space for disagreement. But disagreement quickly became defiance, and defiance revealed that the center's authority rested on a foundation that had quietly eroded. Economic control collapsed next. The Soviet economy operated as a single integrated system. Factories in one republic supplied parts to factories in another. Ukraine grew wheat that fed Russia. Kazakhstan produced metals that fed Ukrainian factories. This interdependence was managed through central planning. Moscow decided what each region would produce, where goods would go, and what price would be charged. Perestroika disrupted this system without replacing it with a functional market. Republics gained the authority to manage their own economies, but still depended on supplies from other republics. As the economy deteriorated, regions began hoarding goods. Ukraine stopped sending grain to Russia. Russia stopped sending oil to Ukraine. Republics stopped remitting tax revenue to Moscow. The central government lost the funds needed to pay the military, maintain infrastructure, or subsidize failing industries. By 1990, the Soviet state was running out of money. Pensioners went unpaid. Soldiers lacked proper equipment. Shelves in state stores were empty. The material incentive that had secured compliance for decades disappeared. And without the material incentive, the only tool left was coercion. But coercion also depended on resources and coordination. The Soviet military was massive, but its personnel came from all 15 republics. Officers were Russian, Ukrainian, Georgian, Kazakh. Units stationed in the Baltics developed ties to local populations. The KGB remained powerful, but its own ranks were divided between reformists who supported Gorbachev and hardliners who viewed glasnost as treason. As republics grew bolder, they began asserting sovereignty. Sovereignty was a deliberately ambiguous term. It did not initially mean full independence. It meant that republic law took precedence over Soviet law within that republic's borders. Russia, the largest republic, declared sovereignty in June 1990 under its newly elected president, Boris Yeltsin. Yeltsin and Gorbachev had become rivals. Yeltsin used the Russian parliament to challenge Moscow's central authority, even though Moscow was located within Russia. Other republics followed. By the end of 1990, all 15 republics had declared some form of sovereignty. The Soviet Union still existed legally, but its authority had become theoretical. Gorbachev tried to negotiate a new union treaty that would grant republics more autonomy while preserving a central government. The treaty was scheduled to be signed in August 1991. It never was. On August 18, 1991, a group of hardliners staged a coup. They included the head of the KGB, the defense minister, the interior minister, and the vice president. They placed Gorbachev under house arrest at his vacation residence in Crimea. They declared a state of emergency. They sent tanks into Moscow. Their stated goal was to reverse the reforms and prevent the Union Treaty from dissolving the Soviet state. The coup failed within 3 days. The failure was not inevitable. If the military leadership had united behind the conspirators, if communications had been cut more effectively, if the order to storm the Russian parliament building had been executed, the outcome could have been different. But the coup plotters were divided among themselves. They held a televised press conference where they appeared uncertain, even drunk. They failed to arrest key opposition figures. Most critically, they could not guarantee that military units would follow orders. Boris Yeltsin, president of the Russian Republic, was not detained. He went to the Russian Parliament building, known as the White House, which became the center of resistance. He climbed onto a tank outside the building and called for a general strike. The image was broadcast internationally. Tens of thousands of Muscovites built barricades around the parliament. Some military units defected. Others simply refused to advance. The conspiracy collapsed. Gorbachev returned to Moscow. The coup leaders were arrested, but the institutional damage was irreversible. The coup had been organized by the core of the Soviet security apparatus, the people responsible for enforcing central authority. Their failure proved that the center could no longer compel obedience, even within its own institutions. Within days, republic after republic formalized independence. Estonia declared independence on August 20th. During the coup itself, Latvia and Lithuania followed immediately after. Ukraine's parliament declared independence on August 24th. Belarus on August 25th. Moldova, Azerbaijan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, all in the final days of August. By early September, nearly every republic had issued a formal independence declaration. These were not merely symbolic statements. Republic governments began acting as sovereign states. They took control of institutions on their territory. They stopped transferring tax revenue to Moscow. They established their own foreign ministries and sought diplomatic recognition. They claimed authority over military units stationed within their borders. The Soviet central government still formally existed. Gorbachev still held the title of president. But the state he governed was evaporating. Ministries in Moscow issued orders that no one followed. The parliament debated legislation that applied nowhere. The central bank printed currency that republics refused to accept. The military became the most dangerous point of fragmentation. The Soviet armed forces included over 4 million active personnel, tens of thousands of nuclear weapons, and vast stockpiles of conventional arms. This arsenal was distributed across all 15 republics. As republics claimed sovereignty, they began claiming the military assets on their territory. Ukraine presented the most critical case. It hosted major naval bases, aerospace facilities, and a substantial portion of the Soviet strategic nuclear arsenal. In September, Ukraine's parliament asserted jurisdiction over all military formations on Ukrainian soil. This included 3 armies, the Black Sea Fleet, and roughly 1,800 nuclear warheads. Russia, under Yeltsin, claimed to be the legal successor to the Soviet Union and therefore entitled to all Soviet military assets. Ukraine rejected this claim. So did other republics. There was no mechanism to resolve the dispute. The Soviet command structure still nominally existed, but officers and soldiers were increasingly taking orders from republic governments rather than Moscow. The risk of violent conflict was real. In some locations, it materialized. The Caucasus republics descended into ethnic wars. Transnistria, a Russian-speaking region of Moldova, declared independence from Moldova with support from Soviet military units stationed there. The war killed hundreds and displaced thousands. But the breakup of the core union, the separation of Russia, Ukraine, and the other large republics, proceeded without large-scale combat. This was not because tensions were absent. It was because no side had a clear path to military victory, and all sides feared the consequences of fighting. Gorbachev attempted to negotiate a new union treaty that would preserve some form of federation. He proposed a loose confederation where republics would retain most power but coordinate defense and economic policy. He convened meetings with republic leaders. Most attended, none committed. The problem was legitimacy. Republics had elected governments that derived authority from local populations. Those governments had promised sovereignty. Voters expected independence. Any leader who agreed to resubordinate their republic to Moscow would lose political support at home. Gorbachev's position weakened further. The Communist Party, which had been the organizational backbone of his power, was banned in Russia after the coup. Gorbachev resigned as general secretary. The party apparatus dissolved. Without the party, Gorbachev had no institutional base. He was president of a union whose members had left. The economic situation deteriorated. The Soviet budget depended on revenue from republics. When republics stopped remitting taxes, Moscow could not pay salaries or pensions. The central bank printed money to cover shortfalls, causing inflation. Shortages worsened. Bartering replaced monetary exchange in many areas. People stood in lines for bread and milk. Factories shut down because supply chains had collapsed. Inter-republic trade, which had been centrally planned, broke down. Factories in one republic depended on components from another. When borders hardened and republics imposed export restrictions, production stopped. The Soviet economy had been integrated across republic lines for decades. Disintegration meant simultaneous economic collapse across the former Union. Some republics wanted to preserve economic coordination. Kazakhstan's leader proposed maintaining a common currency and customs union. But Russia and Ukraine could not agree on terms. Ukraine wanted full economic sovereignty. Russia claimed ownership of Soviet assets and refused to share them equally. Negotiations stalled. By late autumn, the Soviet Union existed only on paper. Gorbachev retained the office of president. The Kremlin still functioned as a government building. But the state had no territory, no revenue, no military command, and no compliance from the republics. International recognition accelerated the process. Western governments had been cautious. The United States maintained official relations with the Soviet government throughout the spring and summer. But after the failed coup, the calculation changed. The Soviet Union was clearly disintegrating. The question was whether to recognize the new republics or maintain the fiction of Soviet unity. The Baltic states were recognized quickly. They had been independent before World War II and were annexed by force. Their independence claims had stronger international legal standing. The United States recognized them in early September. European states followed. The larger republics presented a more complex decision. Recognizing them would formally end the Soviet Union, but refusing recognition would not preserve it. The Soviet state was already gone in practice. Recognition simply acknowledged reality. Ukraine forced the issue. On December 1st, 1991, Ukraine held a referendum on independence. Voters were asked whether they supported the independence declaration issued in August. Turnout was over 80%. More than 90% voted yes. Even in regions with large Russian-speaking populations, majorities supported independence. The result was unambiguous. Ukraine, with a population of 52 million and territory larger than France, had chosen independence overwhelmingly. Any hope of preserving the Union was finished. Yeltsin recognized Ukraine's independence immediately. This was a political decision, not just an acknowledgement of fact. Russia could have contested Ukraine's borders, particularly in Crimea, which had been transferred from Russia to Ukraine in 1954 and had a majority Russian population. Yeltsin chose not to. Recognizing Ukraine served his interests. It ended Gorbachev's attempts to preserve a union that would limit Russian sovereignty. On December 8th, Yeltsin met with the leaders of Ukraine and Belarus at a hunting lodge near the Belarusian city of Brest. The meeting was secret. No agenda was published in advance. The three leaders signed an agreement dissolving the Soviet Union and creating a new entity called the Commonwealth of Independent States. The Commonwealth was not a federation. It had no central government. It was a framework for coordinating foreign policy and economic matters. But membership was voluntary, and each state retained full sovereignty. The agreement was legally questionable. The three leaders had no constitutional authority to dissolve the Soviet Union, but they controlled the three Slavic republics that had founded the Union in 1922. They commanded the largest territories, populations, and economies. Their decision made the Soviet Union's continued existence impossible. Gorbachev denounced the agreement as illegal. He called it a coup, but he had no power to reverse it. The Russian government, under Yeltsin, controlled the Kremlin and Moscow. Gorbachev was president of a state that no longer existed in any material sense. Other republics joined the Commonwealth or declared full independence. Central Asian republics initially hesitated. Their leaders had been Soviet officials and were not leading independence movements, but they had no choice. If Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus had left the Union was over. By mid-December, all remaining republics had either joined the Commonwealth or declared independence outright. On December 25, 1991, Gorbachev resigned. He delivered a televised address from the Kremlin. He defended his reforms and argued that the Union could have been preserved. He criticized the Brest Agreement, but he accepted that his position had become untenable. He signed a decree terminating his office. That evening, the Soviet flag was lowered from the Kremlin flagstaff. The Russian tricolor was raised in its place. The Soviet Union ceased to exist. 15 new states now occupied the territory. They faced immediate crises. Borders were disputed. Ethnic minorities feared persecution. Military assets, including nuclear weapons, had to be divided or secured. Currencies needed to be established. Trade relationships had to be rebuilt. Some republics had functioning governments. Others were ruled by former Soviet officials with no legitimacy or competence. The transitions varied. The Baltic states moved quickly toward integration with Europe. They established democratic institutions, privatized state assets, and sought membership in Western alliances. Central Asian republics remained under authoritarian control, often led by the same officials who had governed during Soviet times. Russia itself entered a period of political and economic chaos. Hyperinflation destroyed savings. Organized crime filled the vacuum left by collapsed state institutions. Regional governors ignored Moscow. Chechnya declared independence and fought two brutal wars with Russia. The Caucasus became a zone of ethnic conflict. Armenia and Azerbaijan fought over Nagorno-Karabakh, an Armenian majority region inside Azerbaijan. Georgia faced secessionist movements in Abkhazia and South Ossetia. These wars killed tens of thousands and displaced hundreds of thousands more. Ceasefires were unstable. Russia intervened selectively, supporting separatists in some conflicts and opposing them in others. The nuclear question created the most acute international concern. When the Soviet Union dissolved, nuclear weapons were stationed in 4 republics: Russia, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and Belarus. The United States and other nuclear powers feared that warheads could be sold, stolen, or used in regional conflicts. Negotiations to secure and consolidate the arsenal took years. Ukraine eventually agreed to transfer its warheads to Russia in exchange for security guarantees and financial compensation. Kazakhstan and Belarus followed. The speed of institutional collapse created problems that no one had prepared to solve. Soviet ministries had managed everything, from pension payments to air traffic control across 11 time zones. When those ministries ceased to exist, 15 republics had to build replacement systems simultaneously. Some functions required immediate coordination. Commercial flights between republics needed agreements on airspace, landing rights, and safety standards. Without those agreements, routes shut down. Trade required customs procedures and currency exchange mechanisms. Banks needed to establish correspondent relationships. Legal systems had to define citizenship, property rights, and contract enforcement. The Soviet ruble remained the common currency initially, but each republic began issuing its own money. This created immediate arbitrage opportunities and inflation spirals. Factories in one republic depended on suppliers in another. When borders became meaningful economic barriers, supply chains fractured. Enterprises that had operated as integrated units found themselves divided across international boundaries. A factory in Belarus might depend on a steel mill in Ukraine and sell finished products to Russia. Now, each transaction crossed AEC border and required hard currency that none of the parties possessed. The collapse of coordination hit ordinary people hardest. Pensions stopped arriving. Savings evaporated as inflation destroyed currency value. State enterprises shut down, eliminating jobs. The safety net that had guaranteed housing, healthcare, and employment disappeared. Black markets and barter systems became survival mechanisms. People sold possessions to buy food. Professionals, engineers, teachers, scientists left for opportunities abroad or took jobs in the emerging private sector that had nothing to do with their training. The Soviet military fragmented along republic lines, but the process was chaotic rather than orderly. Officers and soldiers had to choose which country they now served. Some units divided internally based on ethnicity or birthplace. Equipment and bases became subjects of negotiation and sometimes conflict. The Black Sea Fleet, stationed in Crimea, became a point of contention between Russia and Ukraine. Both countries claimed ownership. The dispute lingered for years, eventually resolved by agreements to split the fleet and share basing rights. The question of borders became urgent. Soviet internal boundaries between republics had been administrative lines, often drawn arbitrarily. Some followed ethnic patterns, others ignored them entirely. When those lines became international borders, disputes erupted. Russia and Ukraine disagreed over Crimea, which had been transferred from Russian to Ukrainian jurisdiction in 1954, as a symbolic gesture when both were Soviet republics. The transfer had meant little at the time, but became consequential when the republics became separate countries. Similar disputes arose elsewhere. Moldova and Russia argued over Transnistria, a narrow strip of territory along Moldova's eastern border, where Russian-speaking separatists declared independence with Russian military support. Central Asian republics faced complex border issues. The Fergana Valley, a densely populated agricultural region, was divided among Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan in ways that left ethnic enclaves and created dependencies on neighbors for water and transportation. The international community had to decide how to engage with 15 new states. Recognition came in stages. The United States and European countries moved quickly to establish diplomatic relations with republics they saw as stable or strategically important. The Baltics received recognition almost immediately. Russia, as the successor state to the Soviet Union, inherited the Soviet seat at the United Nations Security Council. Other republics had to apply for UN membership. Economic aid and investment flowed unevenly. Western governments and international financial institutions offered assistance tied to market reforms and political liberalization. Some republics embraced these conditions, others resisted. The International Monetary Fund and World Bank extended loans to support currency stabilization and privatization programs. The results varied. Poland and the Baltic states implemented reforms that produced economic growth after initial painful contractions. Russia's privatization process enriched insiders and created a class of oligarchs who acquired state assets at fractions of their value. Energy resources shaped the economic trajectories of several republics. Russia, Kazakhstan, and Azerbaijan possessed significant oil and gas reserves. Turkmenistan had natural gas. These resources provided revenue, but also created dependencies. Pipeline routes built during the Soviet era ran through multiple countries. Russia controlled key export infrastructure, giving it leverage over neighbors. Disputes over transit fees and supply contracts became tools of political pressure. The question of Soviet debt was resolved through negotiation. Russia agreed to assume the Soviet Union's external obligations in exchange for claiming Soviet assets abroad, embassies, gold reserves, foreign investments. Other republics accepted this arrangement because they lacked the capacity to service a share of the debt. The deal gave Russia a stronger claim to successor state status, but also burdened it with significant financial obligations. Cultural and linguistic policies became markers of independence. Several republics elevated their national languages to official status and reduced the role of Russian. This created tensions in regions with large Russian-speaking populations. The Baltics required language proficiency for citizenship, effectively disenfranchising many ethnic Russians who had settled during the Soviet period. Central Asian republics shifted alphabets from Cyrillic to Latin scripts to emphasize separation from Russian influence. Ukraine promoted Ukrainian language in schools and government, while debates over language policy became intertwined with questions of national identity. The collapse created a massive refugee and migration crisis. Ethnic Russians living in other republics faced discrimination or violence in some areas. Millions moved to Russia. At the same time, people from poorer republics migrated to Russia and Kazakhstan, seeking work. Displaced populations from conflict zones in the Caucasus and Central Asia sought refuge wherever they could find it. Governments struggled to manage these flows. Infrastructure could not support the influx. Social services were already strained. Environmental disasters, inherited from the Soviet period, became the responsibility of individual republics without the resources to address them. The Aral Sea, once the world's fourth largest lake, had been drained by Soviet irrigation projects that diverted its feeder rivers to cotton fields. By the 1990s, it had shrunk to a fraction of its former size, leaving behind toxic dust and destroyed fishing communities. Cleanup fell to Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan, neither of which had the funds or technical capacity for remediation. The Chernobyl nuclear disaster site sat in Ukraine near the border with Belarus. Both countries dealt with ongoing contamination and health consequences. Semipalatinsk in Kazakhstan had been the Soviet nuclear testing ground. Hundreds of tests had left the region poisoned. The new Kazakh government inherited the cleanup obligation, but had no experience managing nuclear waste. The Commonwealth of Independent States, created by Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus in December 1991, and later joined by other republics, was meant to provide a framework for cooperation. It failed to function as intended. The organization had no enforcement mechanism. Member states ignored agreements they found inconvenient. Economic integration remained minimal. Military coordination existed only in limited forms. The Commonwealth became largely symbolic, a forum for occasional meetings, but not a meaningful successor to Soviet centralized authority. Some republics looked to regional alliances outside the former Soviet space. The Baltic states pursued NATO and European Union membership. Georgia, Moldova, and Ukraine expressed similar aspirations, though progress was slower and more contested. Central Asian republics joined organizations like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which included China. Azerbaijan aligned with Turkey. These choices reflected different visions of national identity and security. The idea of reversing the collapse had some support within Russia during the 1990s, particularly among communists and nationalists who saw the Soviet dissolution as a humiliation. However, no realistic mechanism existed to reconstitute the Union. The other republics had no interest in rejoining. The Russian government lacked the capacity to compel them, even if it had wanted to try. Instead, Russia focused on maintaining influence through economic leverage, military presence in some regions, and support for separatist movements in neighboring countries. The transformation from superpower to 15 separate states redefined global politics. The Cold War structure, organized around US-Soviet competition, disappeared. The United States emerged as the sole superpower. Russia retained a large nuclear arsenal and a permanent Security Council seat, but lost much of its economic and military power. Other former republics were small players on the international stage, their influence limited to regional issues. The collapse demonstrated that institutional power is not the same as institutional permanence. The Soviet Union commanded vast resources and territory. It possessed one of the world's largest militaries. Yet when the mechanisms of coordination failed, when republics stopped complying and the center lost the will or capacity to enforce obedience, the structure came apart in months.